Hello there, here's John Francois back to our presidential series with Abraham Lincoln. Now, I promised you a photo of Mary Todd Lincoln, the woman that he married. I didn't have a picture of her in the last video, but here she is, Mary Todd Lincoln. This is kind of an older picture. When she was younger, I would assume she was prettier. She had a lot of suitors. And here's a little drawing of their wedding day. They actually, got married in a house. And here they are, getting married, Abraham. So anyway, they got married. Lincoln's 6'4" tall. Mary's about 1 foot shorter. And when they got married, Lincoln would refer to her as Molly. And then when she became a mother to his children, he called her Mother. And Mary would call Lincoln Mr. Lincoln. I'm not even kidding. That's what she called him. So anyway, they bought their first house in about 1844. The house, it was in Springfield, Illinois, cost $1,200. I guess a dollar could go a lot farther back in those days. Now, very, very soon, they started having children. And this is Robert Lincoln. This is the oldest one. Now, I neglected to get a picture of Robert as a young boy, but this is Robert Lincoln. And very, very soon afterwards, here's little Eddie Lincoln, Edward Lincoln, if I can put a little close-up on that one. Here, I did get a picture of him as a little boy. So anyway, Robert Lincoln and Edward Lincoln. So Lincoln finally has a family. He has a wife and 2 boys. Now, unfortunately, though, Abraham Lincoln had turned into his dad. Not in the abusive state, but Lincoln was very, very distant. He was withdrawn. He was withdrawn from his boys, and he was withdrawn from his wife. That's just kind of the guy he was. They shared politics. They adored each other. They loved each other very much, especially in those early years. Now, Mary was scared of storms. She was scared of dogs. She was scared of burglars. So every time there was a big storm or something was going on, Abraham Lincoln would leave the law practice. He was a lawyer by this point, and run home. The Whig Party nominated William Henry Harrison to run for president, and Abraham Lincoln campaigned to get William Henry Harrison to become president, and William Henry Harrison won, and 30 days later, he was dead. Died of pneumonia. What can I tell you? Down the line, Abraham Lincoln decides to run for the House of Representatives. And I'm not talking about Illinois local politics. Now he's going to the big one. He's going all the way to Washington, D.C., and he runs for representative of the 7th District. And he campaigns, and he wins. So he wins, and he goes to D.C. Now, anyway, sometime after that, Abraham Lincoln was going to help a man named Zachary Taylor. General Zachary Taylor was running for president. Abraham Lincoln helped Zachary Taylor, campaigned for him, and Zachary Taylor won, became president, and 1 year later, he was dead. He drank some cold milk or something, had some stomach ailments, and died. Excuse me. So anyway, Abraham Lincoln is in the House of Representatives and Congress. After he finished 1 term, and he had promised for some reason to only have 1 term, he had no real accomplishments. Lincoln felt like a failure. He left Congress and had done really nothing. He had not left a mark. They go back to Illinois, back to Springfield. He starts working in his law practice. He actually becomes a corporate lawyer for a railroad company. Now, what happens? He's thinking about, what am I going to do with my life? But around that time, Mary's father, who she was very, very close to, passed away. So Mary's father passes away. And of course, she was very distraught. She was very sad over all of that. But that same year, little Eddie got sick. He had actually tuberculosis. Now, the Lincolns stayed by his side. There was a vigil by his side. Mary never left the little boy. 52 days. And after 52 days, little Eddie died. And obviously, both parents grieved very, very, very much. But here comes a pattern. There would be more tragedies in their lives. Mary Lincoln was so distraught and so grief-stricken that Lincoln, who was a very withdrawn man anyway, would kind of like swallow up his grief and try to help her. And this became a pattern for the rest of their lives, really. So now Mary would she would cry and be grief-stricken, sometimes get into convulsions, sometimes fainting spells, and so forth. Okay, so they lost a son. Thank goodness, less than a year later, she got pregnant again, had another boy, little Willie. This is Willie Lincoln right over here. And not too long after that, they had a little boy named Tad. And here's Tad Lincoln, if you can see that. That's him as a teenager. And him as a little boy right there. Tad and Willie Okay. By that point, Robert was obviously a little bit older. He's the oldest. But Lincoln had changed. By that point, he became more of a more affectionate dad. I'm sweating. I'm sorry. He became more of an affectionate dad, and he became close to these boys. He spoiled them rotten. He really didn't discipline these boys. Um, Now, Tad, I said Tad. Tad's real name was Thomas. What happened was that when he was born, Lincoln felt that his head was so big that he looked like a tadpole. Here's a picture of him right over here. So anyway, Lincoln didn't want to, thank goodness they didn't call him Tadpole, but they called him Tad. Okay, now around this time, the Fugitive Slave Law passed. Now, this law meant that if a slave escaped a slave state in the South and went north, that the North was obligated to send him back. And here's a little reward uh, here, $50 reward for an escaped 40-year-old black slave named Albert. So the North obviously, abolitionists objected to this. And Lincoln's right-hand man, his law partner, said, you know, protest this, do something. But Lincoln refused to get involved. He was kind of depressed and withdrawn. Around this time, his partner says that Lincoln felt miserable. Mary had never gotten over the death of little Eddie, and at one point he was so withdrawn that he was sitting there in the house and she was talking to him to get some firewood to make a fire, and he wasn't really paying attention. So she asked him twice. He didn't listen. She got mad and threw a piece of firewood at him, hit him in the head. So the marriage is in trouble. Lincoln's political life, he feels, is over. And his law partner says that many times he would see Abraham Lincoln walk home miserable and just bent over and sad. Mary, again, I mentioned, was very, very expressive. Lincoln, the more pain Lincoln felt, the more he would withdraw, which of course caused them to clash. Around that time, the Kansas-Nebraska bill passed. From previous videos, you might remember the Kansas-Nebraska bill meant that basically the state of Kansas and Nebraska, they could vote to see if they wanted to be a slave state or a free state, allow slavery or not allow slavery, and they could vote on it. Now, uh, this was very controversial because before that, there had been the Missouri Compromise, the south part of a certain latitude. The states would be slave. Above that, it would be free. But now they're saying, no, you could vote on it. So at this point, Lincoln finds his calling. Now remember, he's anti-slavery. He finds his calling, and what they really wanted was at this point not to abolish slavery, but to keep slavery from expanding to all the other new states. So Lincoln finds his calling. He starts giving speeches. These speeches start getting published. They start getting spread all over in the newspapers all over the country. And Mary Lincoln, now she finds a calling too. She becomes a hostess. They start having parties in the house. They start talking politics. She starts getting involved, and very therapeutic. Now, Senator Stephen Douglas was running for Senate. Lincoln decides to run against him. And the platform they were using was the slavery, basically. They were talking a lot about slavery. They held the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln was about 1 foot taller than small little Stephen Douglas. And they ran against each other. And there were many, many debates. And these debates were published. Now, these debates would go on for hours. Not like the debates that we have here, a couple of hours, and they cut it off with all these little media bites and all of that. No. Back then, they would talk for hours and hours, go to another city, debate again for several hours, and so forth. I think there were about 7 debates. Now, in the debates, Douglas says that state rights, you should be able to vote if you wanted to have slavery or not slavery. And if the majority says we could have slavery, then what's the problem? Now, Lincoln said no. Some things are immoral. Slavery is immoral. And just because a majority wants something doesn't mean that it's right. Today, the issue of slavery, obviously, who's going to vote to have slavery? But you might say, well, what about state rights? Well, let's just say a state wants to put it in contrast. If something's immoral, or you consider it immoral, such as we could all agree that murder is immoral, we should not be able to vote on it, whether we should be able to have it or not have it. I guess that is where Lincoln is coming from. Now, Stephen Douglas threw a trap at him and asked him, are you saying that the races are equal? Now, keep in mind, this is back in the mid-1800s. Are you saying that the races are equal? Now, remember, Lincoln was anti-slavery, at this point did not believe that the races were equal. And if he did say that they were, he would be considered an extremist. Not that that's a bad thing, but basically, what did he say? They asked him, "Do you think that the races are equal?" Well, Lincoln said, "No. Physically, there are differences. Obviously, we are not equal in color. Perhaps not intellectually or morally. But when it comes to the right of a man to earn his bread, then I am equal to that black man, and so is Stephen Douglas." It sounds a little of a lofty premise, the words poetic that he used, but you see the hint of racism behind it, saying we're not necessarily equal intellectually or morally. Now, there's a man named John Calhoun, and I'm going to show you a picture of John Calhoun. John Calhoun said that slavery was a good. And here he is right here. There's several little pictures. Now, this guy looks very, very creepy. But he was extremely famous and extremely popular in the South. And John Calhoun said that slavery was a good. It was a necessary good. And you might say, well, how do you equate that? How do you validate that? Okay, the thoughts were that Africans were savages, pulled out of a savage land, pulled out of an unchristian land, that they were lazy, that they were shiftless, that they were non-Christians. If you take a savage African and bring him to the civilized southern United States and put him on the plantation and have him work, he will no longer be lazy or shiftless. He'll learn what hard labor is. And beyond that, they will become Christians. And to become Christians, you save their souls. The plantation would teach them to be civilized. So, this goes on. The debates went on. Now you see where this is all coming from. But what happened was, when the Senate race was over and the votes were counted, Abraham Lincoln lost. He lost to Stephen Douglas. And how did he feel about it? Well, when they asked him, he says, "I feel like that little boy who stubbed his toe and says, it hurts too much to laugh, but I'm too big to cry." Now, one good thing that happened with that, though, was that he got national recognition. And when 1860 came around, the presidential election was coming. By this point, the Whigs, that was the party Lincoln belonged to, they were kind of divided with the slavery issue. But Lincoln joined a new party. It was called the Republican Party. And when he joined the Republican Party, the candidate the Republican Party was really leaning toward was this man right here, William Seward. William Seward could have become president of the United States. And if he had, might have been just as successful as Abraham Lincoln. Right now, we'll never know. He was an abolitionist, though. He wasn't just thinking about the Union. Lincoln was talking about Union. He wasn't talking about freeing slaves or any of this. This man was talking about freeing slaves. And there were a couple of ballots. Seward actually came ahead in the ballots. And in the third ballot, though, however, Lincoln came through. Why? Because Lincoln was considered a moderate. Lincoln never said he wanted to free slaves, not during the presidential election. He said he wanted to keep the Union together, and he had made promises that it was actually illegal to free the slaves, which, by the way, it was. The Constitution allowed slavery. So anyway, a lot of people in the South said they would leave the Union if Lincoln were to be elected president. Well, it was a very, very close election. Now, to give you an idea, when people say, well, the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about state rights, well, look at this poster right here. The two platforms, the Democrats and the Republican platform. Democrats right over here is, the Democratic platform says, is for the white man. And the Republican Party is for the Negro. Plain and simple. Anyway, by the third ballot, Lincoln was nominated to the Republican Party. And when the election came, he won by a very, very close margin. He didn't have a real mandate. And when that happened, and he found out about it, he walked home. And he walked home to see Mary, and he said, when he saw her, he said, "Mother, we are elected." Abraham Lincoln becomes president of the United States. Shortly afterwards, the Civil War began. This is John Franquez. Comment below, subscribe. Take care.